Thank you.
Long title. Thank you. All right, so I have no disclosures. All right, so we know that more than 80% of people with spinal cord injury experience some kind of lower urinary tract dysfunction, right? And we also know that pelvic floor muscle training is effective in alleviating some of these symptoms, such as incontinence and even episodes of neurogenic detrusor overactivity. However, we've yet to seriously prescribe pelvic floor muscle training to the spinal cord injury population because it's kind of unclear if they retain voluntary control over this muscle group after injury. This is especially true for those who are classified as motor complete, meaning that according to standard clinical exams, they should be fully paralyzed or present with no motor function below their injury level. But evidence from my lab and other labs around the world are showing that this type of classification may be flawed and that many people actually do retain functional sparing below their injury level, especially to the abdominals and paraspinals or other muscles of the core. So we wanted to know, to what extent may the pelvic floor muscle be similarly spared in the spinal cord injury population? So for this study, we had 9 motor complete spinal cord injury subjects, as well as 8 able-bodied controls. And we led them through 2 parts of the study. In part 1, we wanted to know if the pelvic floor muscle could be voluntarily activated. And in part 2, we wanted to use TMS over the pelvic floor representation in the cortex to see if we could elicit an MEP response, or a motor evoked potential, which I'll get into. So for our study, we used surface EMGs that were fixed bilaterally, perianally, so over the perineum. And we actually used the right and left side. So you can see, actually I'll go back a second, but we had participants complete a series of coactivation maneuvers as well as isolated contractions. So we're looking at some sample data from an able-bodied subject on the left and a spinal cord injury subject on the right. And they're going through each of the different tasks, right? So trunk flexion, abdominal hollowing, Kegels, etc. And so on the right, pelvic floor is represented by the blue trace, and the orange pelvic floor, the orange pelvic floor, the left pelvic floor is represented by the orange trace. And the gray boxes represent the period during which they're actually asked to do the given contraction. So you can see for the able-bodied subject, they have a pretty good response for most of the maneuvers, especially in the Kegel and gluteal contraction. And for the spinal cord injury subject, we really see most of the activation occurring during the trunk maneuvers, so trunk flexion, side bending, and trunk extension, with no real activity happening during the Kegel. If we summarize this across all of our spinal cord subjects, here we're looking at the right and left responses in the gray bars and had individual data plotted over top as the colorful circles. And we can see again that most people are having responses during the trunk flexion, side bending, and trunk extension, but no real activity during the targeted Kegel contraction. For TMS, if you're not familiar with that protocol, what we do is essentially use a magnetic coil to stimulate over the primary motor cortex and the pelvic floor representation. The signal then should travel down through the spinal cord, hopefully past the injury site, and cause the pelvic floor to briefly contract in what we call a motor evoked potential, or an MEP, which then we can capture using EMG in this sort of waveform pattern. If you look at some of our able-bodied data, here we can see from one subject there's a series of EMG traces that have been overlaid on top of each other in the top left corner, and they're rainbow color-coded. So the ones that are red are the most intense stimulations and produce the largest MEP, which we can plot below. So again, MEP amplitude, the size of the waveform, increases with the size of intensity stimulation that we deliver. For the spinal cord injury subjects, here's just 2 as an example. We also see similar MEP responses, so similar connectivity from the brain to the pelvic floor. MEPs are smaller though, but they do respond in a similar fashion that they increase with stimulus intensity. So in conclusion, we have activation of the pelvic floor is possible for most of our spinal cord injury subjects. We saw voluntary responses in 7 of 9. But the responses were largely driven by the synergistic or co-activation as opposed to the direct contractions. We also saw cortical sparing to the pelvic floor in 8 of our 9 subjects, suggesting that there is that direct connection from the brain to the pelvic floor. And for the next steps for our lab is going to be using this information to maybe help develop some kind of pelvic floor training program or intervention that we could then use for spinal cord injury. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Questions from the floor?
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry. Paul Hodges from Australia. Really interesting study. Did you also measure the MEPs in limb muscles to confirm that you could also get through the spinal cord injury for limb muscles?
Right. So we actually recorded from the abdominals, so rectus abdominis, external obliques, glutes, and paraspinals, but we didn't do limbs. That being said, there has been other research out of UBC, where we're from in Canada, where they did do limb and sort of lower body muscle groups, and they found the similar results for sure.
So you were also able to record potentials in the other trunk muscles?
Yes,
okay.
Yeah, abdominals and glutes, yeah.
And your MEP for the spinal cord injury patient was really sloppy. So it was really sharp in the healthy individual and really not a sloppy recording, but it's
it just looks different.
Huge duration. And so do you have any idea about, it's clearly a different sequence of direct and indirect waves that's causing this. Have you any idea what's happening?
Absolutely. That's a really good question. We're still thinking about it. I think that it's possible that we're recording through different pathways, and maybe we're getting sort of a delay latency from maybe different signals that are making their way down to the pelvic floor. If you also look to the able-bodied subject right after the really sharp waveform, there's kind of a mess, and then it stables out again. And if you look at the scaling, that's really, it's like 10 times smaller, right? So we might just be picking up that kind of movement artifact or that mess after the signal as well. But if you have ideas, I'd love to hear them.
And so, and with when you do the trunk movements
Yeah.
to try and evoke contraction, because you're using these surface electrodes perianally,
Yes.
are you really, and you didn't get much activation with a direct Kegel.
Yes.
Do you think you can exclude crosstalk as a
Cross-talk.
contributor to the
It's
other?
a great question.
components?
Yes, so I thought this might come up, so I don't know if this is allowed, but I have a surprise extra slide. So we have, at least in our spinal cord injury, because we looked at glute max being a big crosstalk problem. And so for our spinal cord injury subjects, especially on the right side, you're looking at pelvic floor at the top, glute at the bottom. And you can see the glutes just really weren't active at all across any of the different maneuvers. So at least from that muscle group, I'm not expecting crosstalk. But you're right. I mean, there's concern for any type of EMG with pelvic floor that crosstalk's an issue.
And the hip adductors
And everything else, absolutely, yes. Thank you.
Okay, my question is very short. What was the scale you used to be sure that they were complete spinal cord injury?
So we use what's called the International Standard for Neurological Classification of Spinal Cord Injury, which is sort of the gold standard classification
Asia?
scale.
It's Asia?
It's part of the Asia scale.
Oh,
Yes, yeah. So we had a registered nurse do it with everybody.
Okay, and they were all
Yes, everyone.
The A is the complete, right?
A is complete. Yes. So everyone is A. There are 2 Asia Bs. So have some spared sensation.
And even
but-
so, the pelvic floor was functioning.
Yeah, these are all Asia A's and Bs. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.